Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ethical Perspectives. My name is Beth Parker, and I'm your moderator this evening. Our topic is end-life transitions. Our executive director provided me with links to previous episodes of Ethical Perspectives that focused on this issue. And I learned that in America, we often wait until death is imminent, and then there's great turmoil about decisions to be made and who makes them and with what objective. So we will revisit those concepts tonight, but it's also true that not all cultures see this process as Americans do. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, the author is so vivid in his description of the death process, it almost is like he's gone through that process and come back to explain it. But let's find out what our panelists think. So I invite you panelists to introduce yourself and tell us a little about your related experience and your expertise, and share how you define this process. Do you call it death with dignity? Do you call it life transitions? Who would like to start?
I'm Derith Vogt. I have recently started working with Compassion and Choices, which is a national organization. In this country, we don't want to discuss the fact that none of us get out of here alive. I think it's important to talk with your physician, think about what you want, write down what you want. There's so many wonderful resources. There's honoring your wishes, which you can go through some scenarios of what might happen and what you might want, because it's really hard to find yourself in a position where you can't do anything and your family has to make that decision for you. It's very uncomfortable and
what do you call this process? How would you describe it?
I would call it death with dignity.
Okay.
And
I think
working legislatively towards medical aid in dying.
Mm-hmm.
I'm William Galbraith. I'm a retired physician. I wish I knew what I know now when I was practicing internal medicine, because there are so many new things that have added, I think, comfort and calming to those who face death. We're getting to a point where new things are being developed, and I want to talk a little later about something called the doula, which is a word that it used to be used for midwifery, but now we have end-of-life doulas.
How do you spell that?
D-O-U-L-A. It's a new movement. It's not so new because it started in about 2003, but I'll mention more of that later.
Okay.
My name is Lori Erickson, and I'm a writer. I write about the intersection of travel and spirituality. And several years ago, when I experienced the loss of my brother, the same week that my mother entered memory care in a nursing home, I decided to write a book focused on places that have helped me come to terms with mortality. And so the book came out last August. It's called Near the Exit, Travels with a Not-So-Grim Reaper. And it's very much the sort of cultural examination that you referred to as being a help, I think, to people who can see that there are other options out there, other ways of viewing this universal transition. Yeah. And I would say, too, my best qualification for talking about this is that I'm mortal. That I think everyone has a right to examine these things and give their opinion, and it's part of being human.
There's nothing wrong with the word death. That's my choice. Why change it? Why transitions? That's,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Laura, your description, your definition of the process?
Well, I would say the title of my book, Near the Exit. This sense of, the exit, it brings to mind the exit ramp off of a highway. This sense of approaching a turn that we don't quite know what's on the other side, if anything. But it's a shift, it's a transition point, a borderland, you could say.
So, Dr. Galbraith, you read the book. What were would you like to share some of your thoughts?
I really enjoyed one part of it in particular. When I was a young man, I lived in Phoenix, and I lived there from the age of 12 until I finished college. And I had no real idea of how the Mexican people, and many lived in Phoenix, how they celebrate, in a sense, or they don't necessarily celebrate, but they really have a system of honoring the dead. And they do things that I think give lots of compassion and time for, we call it healing or grieving. That can be done in a way the Mexicans, I think, are ahead of many of us.
Oh, I would agree,
Yes.
absolutely.
So I really enjoyed the book. I read it all, of course, but that first part I really liked, Lori. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
So of your cultural and world travels, anything stick? I mean, it was a wonderful book, and also with humor. I mean, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, true.
So anything in particular, any particular episode or
Well, I would agree with you, actually, that my favorite part of the book, too, is the parts about Mexican attitudes towards death, and in particular, the custom of Day of the Dead, which we actually just celebrated November 1st and 2nd in Mexican communities, is a time when the dead are believed to come back, and people go to cemeteries, tend the graves, create altars that have their loved ones' favorite foods, and photographs, in all sorts of ways they evoke the memory of people who have died. And there's so many things I like about that, the mixture of festivity and remembrance, and I'm sure mourning, because death is a loss. And also the cyclical nature of it. You know, it comes around every year. It's a time to remember and reflect, and then life goes back to normal. Knowing that it will come around again the next year. And also just the whimsy and the color of it, you know, the skeleton figures riding bicycles and dressed up as wedding couples. And it's a very different way of looking at mortality, and I think it has a lot to teach the rest of our culture.
So, Derith, share some of your experiences about Compassionate Choices. Tell us a little bit about what that organization is and the legislative endeavors that you're working on.
In Iowa, we had a Senate File 175 and a House Bill 374 sent to the legislature, which did not make it through the funnel. Would like to see Iowa become another state. There are 10 so far in this country, so roughly 20% of this country has access to medical aid in dying. Of the people that qualify, which is being terminally ill with less than 6 months to live and mentally competent, and you have to ask for medication which you take yourself. It's only 1% of the people who ask for it actually take it. And yet the side effect of this is palliative care, which is comfort care for terminally ill, gets better for everybody. People tend to discuss it more with their physicians. It's out there, and it's something that we need to talk about because it is part of the cycle. You're born, you die. And that it's okay.
So it sounds like everyone on the panel is in concert with the whole idea of, you know, let's open this up, let's discuss it, let's talk about something that's inevitable, and how can we do that to the best benefit of all the people involved, you know, the ill person and all of the supportive people around.
There are steps that we should take, and that is to let people know what we'd like, what our choices are for end-of-life approach.
And when do you do that?
You do that when you're about 18 years old. Now, unfortunately,
I'm sure that's a surprise to most.
Unfortunately, only perhaps 30%. As we get older, the percentage comes up. People who are in their 60s are more apt to do this. But nationally, about 27% of people have defined choices made so that we have what's called a living will, a durable power of attorney for health affairs. And when we're frail and death is not too far away, we can have a physician's order that prevents unnecessary resuscitation, trips to intensive care, winding up without any choice really, because physicians are doing what they were supposed to do, and that's protect life. They want to keep people alive, so they use all these tools, and they have so many tools now to help us breathe if we can't breathe. They can make our kidneys work if they don't work. They can put a tube in our belly so we can be fed. They can tie us up in a bed under a bright light for weeks and months in things called extended care. And it's sort of an intensive care at the end of life, which really is a terrible thing to wind up doing. If you make choices early and let people, you have to let people know about it, including your physicians. You have to designate one person you really trust that also has the courage to say, no, Mom said she didn't want to be on a ventilator. Please don't do that. And that's appropriate if the doctors agree that there is, doing more is futile, really. And they know it, but it goes on and on. Not only that, but it's extremely expensive for our society to put up with people who really have no brain function, yet we're keeping them in a sort of a vegetative state simply because somebody said, well, do everything. Keep them going. And that's a mistake.
And to your point, it reminds me of the New York Times article several years ago called Patient Autonomy Gone Wrong. And it talks about a gentleman named Vincent who was a patient, and it was written by a health professional who observed this gentleman as he traveled back and forth from the nursing home to the hospital several times, with a progressive deterioration of his body, so much so that it was offensive to the physician. And the patient had said, keep me alive no matter what, no matter what. You know, at what point does that patient lose the concept of I need to be attached? And so the author wrote, and so this case became the first where I began to openly question our blind trust in patient autonomy. I started to doubt whether this patient's instructions should be our best guide to his medical management. I think, Derith, yeah, go ahead. Whoever was going to.
That was Dr. Jessica Nuttick-Zitter, and she wrote a wonderful book. And for those interested, you might want to find it. It's called Extreme Measures, and it's finding a better way to have a path to the end of life. So she has written also, she's also performed in a video that's excellent. Indeed, we need to be thinking about this. She is involved as in intensive care-like work, but she's also in a palliative care team. Palliative care is bringing together a group of people who have particular expertise in doing everything they can to prevent unnecessary suffering and to have a calming influence towards the end of life, and to help families dealing with their part of this too, as they watch their loved ones prepare to die. So extreme measures are very important.
And I would like to tag along on that to say that I think that these issues are very important, not only for the comfort of the person who is dying, but also for loved ones who are spared the agonizing decisions, agonizing sense of guilt of making a decision in a vacuum. And I think it's one of the best gifts we can give to our children or whoever has the medical power of attorney to make it clear what we want and what we don't want. It's a gift to them as well as to ourselves.
So those watching should make a note that palliative care is not only for those that are dying, but it's a teamwork that will help anyone who has unnecessary pain. I said unnecessary pain because there are ways to almost always control pain. And you know, if we look at, we're afraid of pain when we die, but the people who have really terrible pain that can't be controlled is about 1% of all the people who are dying, if they have a proper approach with the devices that are there to help them, including such things as guided imagery, which is a way to help people escape by using their mind to, I happen to love fly fishing, so I want someone to help me if I'm in that situation when I'm dying, to have me think about being on a trout stream, the water running past my legs, a fly rod in my hand and a big old fish out there. I can see that in my mind's eye, and that can turn off some of the pain that might be there, and certainly is a calming thing so that anxiety can be less. And there are other tricks besides guided imagery that can help. That's well used by people who understand how to get people into that frame of mind.
Derith, you looked like you wanted to.
Well, and the point of being able to obtain a prescription that you could take before you're dying, so you just go to sleep and die peacefully. Most people do not take it, but the reduction in their anxiety is astonishing. You know it's there if it gets unbearable or you're too anxious.
And that's a fight between whom? I mean, how does that work? Where's the resistance to this legislation or to the process? Or, I mean, maybe you can speak to this.
It's not for everyone. It's something I think should be available as an option, should people want it.
Many physicians, as I mentioned earlier, they are devoted to maintaining life, protecting life, and they don't want to have a part in ending life, an active part in ending life. As time has gone on, there are more physicians who are softening in that attitude, and they are beginning to realize that there are situations where an escape that's carefully, really carefully administered can be really a good thing. Many states now, I've forgotten how many, 13, I've forgotten how many,
There are
now have laws that allow this with restrictions and how it's administered.
it's 10
10.
states and Washington, D.C. is one of them.
So it's 11. Yes, good.
So is that something that, what happens in medical school? Is there training about this process? I mean, or,
Students know about it, sure. They're not
But
trained
still-
how to do it, but by the time they finish their training, they know how much barbiturate it takes to kill someone, yeah. So this is something that, I had a sister die of Lou Gehrig's disease when she was in her 50s. And there was a time when that thought came to my mind. She's suffering so much, fighting to breathe. Is this a place for that to happen? And fortunately, we didn't have to go down that path because she passed within a day or two of I having that thought. So it's a we use the word transition. I think it's going to be more readily available. Now, there's another thing that's happening that's extremely important, and that's this doula business. The doula person is trained to do everything they can, not only to make the patient who is facing death comfortable, but the family. And getting the family to understand some of the things that they can do to make healing happen, not only to the person who's dying, but within the family group. Death can tear a family up.
sure.
And there is a movement now. There is an author who I think has done a beautiful job of suggesting to us that we teach people to, at the end of their life, say 4 things. I forgive you. Will you forgive me? I'm sorry. I love you. That can be terribly healing when there are things that have gone on in a family, and very healing for the person who's worried about dying, but I haven't said what I really would like to say. So there are things like that that I think become more and more important. So doulas are in Cedar Rapids, we're trying to organize trained doulas to be available for people who might use them. We haven't accomplished that yet. We're working on it.
Is that in connection with the Caregiver Center? Or?
Yes, it is.
And how does that work? How do people become interested or involved? Or
They can be trained. It's a 3-day course. They take tests, and they can be certified as doulas who help people go through the process.
what are their
Not only helping people actively die and taking care of that moment when they are gone, but making sure the family's okay even 6 months or so afterwards to make sure
Follow
that
up.
the grieving is tough. And grieving needs some attention. So the doulas are trained to bridge that part of this whole process that we call death.
Derith, would you have a thought there? Or it looked like you might? Excuse
It's
me.
part of the addressing what you want and doing it early on.
So I don't want to put you on the spot here, but legislatively, where are we? What?
It's a long haul to get this sort of thing passed.
And what does it take to get it done?
Generally speaking, the best thing is to have somebody who has a story and is willing to go public and be the example.
Over and over and over again. Many
Um,
different examples.
In California, it was a young woman with brain cancer who was in her 30s who had to move to Oregon
Yeah.
to have access to medical aid and dying. And after that, California passed it. It's Oregon, Washington, California, Montana, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, Vermont, DC. It's coming, but
It's been in place in Oregon for more than 10 years.
Why is
and
that?
it has not been abused.
correct.
It's been properly used by CARE through the whole process of making sure that this is a legitimate request.
Sure.
We have a problem with people who are depressed, and to sort out whether it's profound depression that leads to this point is another problem for physicians to sort out.
Generally, it's people that have terminal, not depression. Suicidal is not wanting to be alive, and people seeking medical aid and dying are people who want to be alive, but because of a disease are not going to be able to.
So, Lori, tell us a funny story. I mean, did you ever get scared? Were there some funny things that happened? It seems like I'm remembering some interesting episodes that you experienced.
Well, I do think a sense of humor in relation to these issues is actually not a bad thing. I think of funeral practices. You know, some of the healthiest funerals that I've been to are ones that involve humor about the deceased, where people feel comfortable sharing funny stories and laughter and sadness, tears blend together. And I think that is a very healthy response to death. I do think, too, that it's easy to have blinders on in relation to death practices and not realize that there really is much more of a spectrum than we realize. And so, for example, one of the chapters in my book is about the Maori in New Zealand and a trip that I took with them. And the Maori are a culture that have a very strong sense of ancestors living among them. And if you have that sense, death is still a loss, is still sad, but it's it's part of a larger context that, well, that person will still be with you. And to talk to people who had a very strong sense that their grandmother, for instance, was with them when they needed her, that puts an entirely different spin on death and was very intriguing to me in thinking about my own ideas about mortality.
I liked your visit in the Buddha sense.
Oh, yes, in
You
Colorado.
did a beautiful job of talking
Thank
about
you.
that in your
Yeah,
book.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there's a small town in Colorado called Crestone, which has the country's only non-denominational open-air cremation ground. And I had a conversation with a Buddhist teacher there who talked about the ways in which watching a cremation is perhaps the most powerful lesson that there is in the impermanence of life. And that people take it very seriously when they see a neighbor go up and smoke. And that while there had been controversy when this was first proposed, it's now really become a really beloved part of the life cycle in Crestone. And I don't think open air cremations are something that a lot of places, especially in Iowa, are going to go for. But I think it's good to know that there are such places and that there are a variety of ways of dealing with remains, dealing with these rituals, and that people can claim them, communities can claim them if there's impetus for it.
So in this transition, as we look for alternate ways of looking at death and reducing anxiety, I just wanted to mention Michael Pollan's book. He's an immersion author, and he wrote about food, but he also wrote a book called How Do You Change Your Mind? And just briefly, he offers examples of terminally ill persons who post-psychedelic, it was a guided trial, lost their fear of death and or had other anxiety reduction experiences. And he talks about a terminally ill cancer person who did not want to die, but after going through this experience, his whole presence changed, and that people in the hospital were drawn to him, and he just had this presence. Now that's just amazing to me. And he talks about another woman who had a terrible smoking habit, and after she went through this experience, she said, well, smoking's just irrelevant. I gave up smoking because it's just so trivial. What about stuff like that?
This is appropriately being explored very carefully. There are hospices now in our country that are testing this idea and working with it. And it seems there's some validity, in my opinion, to the whole concept of using psychedelics. We're not there yet as a widespread, let's all do it though. We're not quite there yet.
So what does it take to?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'll hedge on that one.
All right. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I think that, obviously we've just touched the surface of so many things, but I'm hoping that for our viewing audience we have stimulated some ideas, a different way to look at this process. Western culture seems to me to have commodified death, and so I'm going in a couple of different directions here, but before we do finish, I'd like to invite each of you to give us, our viewing audience, a takeaway or perhaps a reference or a resource. 2 minutes we've got, and so as we close here, what would you like to share with our viewing audience? Lori's ready to go.
Well, I'm ready to go because I'd like to have people read my book. It's sort of a shameless plug for that.
It's a great read.
Well, thank you. But I would say books in general that bring up these issues, and I think it's important to normalize conversations about mortality and death well before you are in a position where you're at someone's bedside in an intensive care unit. These are conversations that should happen when you're with your 18-year-old children, when you're in the prime of life, because you never know. And those are much easier conversations to have when death isn't looking over your shoulder directly. So books, conversations, movies, and I do think that there is a bit of a cultural sea change happening in relation to mortality that is very positive.
Thank you. We've got about a minute, so.
I share your idea. The medical directives as documents, signed documents, that's one thing, but really have the conversation with the people you trust to look after you at that time when you're going to die. And that should be someone that is very carefully chosen, that will do what you wished.
I would add to that, sometimes that person who has a medical power of attorney is not a family member because they might be too emotionally
It's hard for a family person to
too
turn
emotionally
off
involved.
a machine.
So.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
So we're getting about the end here signal. I just want to thank you, our panelists, for breaching a topic that just will not die. And make sure that you join us on our next episodes of Ethical Perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
For having us.
Thank you.